Welcome to Conversations with E. I'm Esther, or you can call me E. I'm the founder and CEO of Mind Myself. And it's my pleasure to welcome back Rachel Maurice, MD. We're talking about light and food today. But before we jump into that, Rachel, tell us a little bit about who you are so we have a context for what we're discussing.
Okay, thanks for having me back. It's fun doing this series with you. And so, as E said, my name is Rachel Maurice, and I worked as an anesthesiologist in Canada for close to 20 years. I left the conventional practice in 2021, so I haven't been working as an anesthesiologist for just over 3 years now. And in that time period, I've done a lot of research and unlearning and relearning what it actually means to be for the body to be healthy, because what I learned was all about disease management and basically just stabilizing or at best delaying the progress of a disease. Whereas what I was starting to learn, starting with light and how the body works, light, water, magnetism, and mitochondria, how we can actually optimize health, reverse symptoms, and reverse diseases.
And who wouldn't want that? Is what I have to say. And that's what we're all about at Mind Myself too. So thank you for being along on this journey with us, Rachel. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, light and food. How is this related? We've heard about photosynthesis before, but light in food and light as a nutrient in food. Okay, this is a big topic. Start us off, please.
Yes, it is a big topic. And once again, nothing I had learned in my conventional medical education. So before we actually talk about light being in food, I want to go back to just what light is and the light, the natural light from the sun that we have actually evolved under. And so most of us understand that we see light coming from the sun. When it rains, we see a rainbow come out. So we know that light, although we see it as white, is made up of colors of the spectrum, the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. But there's also non-visible light above the violet range. Most people understand, again, ultraviolet. One of the things we know we make vitamin D from and we get a tan from. And then below the red is infrared. And we understand that as human beings as heat, that we feel as heat. So those are non-visible, but they are there. And so from the infrared all the way through to the ultraviolet is what our body is naturally and ideally adapted to run using. Now, with modernization, technology, and all sorts of other advanced things that we have in society, we've kind of filled up the space with even more frequencies that below, for example, below the infrared, we've got microwaves, which is not just about the microwave that's in the, people use in the kitchen, but there's microwaves and radio waves. They've got longer wavelengths, but they're man-made. And then above the ultraviolet, we've got things like X-rays and gamma rays and cosmic rays, which don't reach the earth or the atmosphere, or the earth. But those are actually man-made, and they're not biologically compatible, but they impact us. So we're not going to go into detail in this episode, but they impact our body negatively, and they actually disrupt and scramble the natural frequencies and wavelengths we're supposed to receive and run with, so that there's confusion.
Wow. Okay. So there's so much to learn, and we're not digging into the deep science of this. And I know that there are a ton of resources we're going to have in the notes for all these episodes. And if you want to learn more and you're a science geek, have at it. So in the meantime, that's great. That was a lovely entrance to this. So light and food.
Right. So we know that we need sunlight to grow food, right? To grow the fruits, vegetables. If you put a tarp over top of your trees or plants, then they're not going to grow. So light is actually incorporated into the food matter, the actual plant matter as it grows. And so one of the things that I didn't quite understand, because I need analogies for my mind to for things to click, is that light is information. And so this light that's incorporated into the food material, when we eat that food and it's then digested in our bodies, that light is released. So again, light is information. And so for people who, like me, need some kind of analogy to say, well, what does that mean? Light is information. Light is a wavelength, it's a frequency. And the analogy that I understand best is when we used to have, for people who are old enough, I guess, radio stations in the car. And when you would tune that radio station, you're picking up a wavelength that's being emitted from a broadcast station. And that it's a wavelength is traveling through the air and then being received by an antenna and then decoded. And then we hear either speaking or music or, a song. And so it's the information carried on that wave that is decoded for us to then hear the words or the music. So that's how waves carry information. I mean, we can go into also Bluetooth stuff, right? How there's connections and stuff. But I think the radio one is a really kind of picturesque one you can actually tangibly understand. So information from the sun gets incorporated into the food, then released in our bodies when we digest it. So with photosynthesis, we know we need light. Trees and plants need carbon dioxide and water to make the plant material, which is ultimately sugar, broken down into sugar. That's called photosynthesis. So we do the opposite in our body when we eat food. We actually do what's called cellular respiration. So we take that glucose and oxygen, and we need sunlight, and we make carbon dioxide, and we make heat, and we release, carbon dioxide, we use sugar, and we make energy. So we need the food that we grow in the environment absorbs the light from that environment. So technically, our eyes and our skin and our body should receive the same light that the food we are eating receives, so that we have similar information. When we eat the food, the light that's released is the same light that we're going to see in our environment. Now, with today's world, where we can access food from all over the world, so if we eat something that's, for example, I think we're at the 51st latitude. If we were to eat something that's grown at the equator or in the tropics, for example, like a pineapple or a coconut, the light that is incorporated into the food, into a pineapple, is very different from the light that we are seeing right now, or actually any time of year.
Okay, but maybe explain that a little, because it's the same sun.
It is the same sun. Okay, so that's true. It's the same sun. When we move away from the equator, the angle of the sun changes, and the amount of time we have light changes from the different seasons. So the angle of the light means that the light's going to bend differently going into the atmosphere, and we're going to lose the ultraviolet B light for a certain period of time. I don't know at what latitude it disappears, but in the tropics, you have strong UVB light all year round. As you move into more northern latitudes, it gets weaker and weaker, and then we lose that. And so again, light is information. So if we're going to eat light that has been grown with UVB, strong UVB light.
Plants, if we eat plants grown with that.
Yes. What did I say?
Light. Oh, good. We can eat light too, but plants, yes, go for it.
Eat plants grown with strong UVB light, but our eyes and our skin are not receiving that UVB light. There's a couple of problems. First of all, that's it's misconstrued information, right? It's different information. Different information receiving by the body causes confusion. And as we talked about, and we can go over a little bit again, Confusion in the body because of light mismatches is a disruption to circadian rhythms, and that causes inflammation in the body. And inflammation is really the basis, chronic inflammation, for most chronic diseases and symptoms. So the other point, and I think we were going to talk about this as well today, but I'm going to bring it up right now because at the equator, food, like I said, plants need water to grow. So the water that's at the equator has a certain amount of what is called deuterium in it. It's actually 155 parts per million. So deuterium, for those people that don't know, and I'm not going to go too deep into this again because it can get confusing. Of hydrogen. So hydrogen is found in water. Everyone knows water is H2O. So hydrogen is the lightest and the first element on the periodic table. As an atom, it has one proton in the middle and then one electron zipping around it. Deuterium has the proton plus a neutron, so another little ball in the nucleus with no charge, so it just makes it heavier and double the size. So when we live at the equator, some things that help us get rid of, we don't want too much deuterium in our body because it messes up our mitochondria. I can explain that if you want to afterwards, but I don't have to, but suffice it to say, it can really mess up our mitochondria if it gets inside and there's too much of it. And as we move in the more northern latitudes, the deuterium content in the water decreases. So it kind of matches that reduction in ultraviolet B light because strong ultraviolet B helps our bodies get rid of deuterium. It helps us what's called deuterium deplete. So if you are living or even vacationing at the equator and you're receiving that strong ultraviolet B light and you're eating foods like a pineapple with a higher deuterium content, then you're in the right environment to be able to get rid of that deuterium. But if you're in a place like we are at the 51st latitude and we eat a pineapple that's higher in deuterium, but we're not under this strong UVB light, then we are going to accumulate more deuterium in our body and have a harder time getting rid of it. There are some ways, but still we have a harder time. And then that will impact our mitochondria, which we've talked about in the last episode, that our mitochondria really are at the heart of how we are alive. It's our little energy factories in our bodies.
Well, so this goes to the conversation around eating local for lots of different reasons, not just to support the local economy, but for light reasons, for water reasons, for digestibility, etc. Wow.
Locally and seasonally.
Right.
Seasonally getting the light, because for us, again, we have 4 seasons, depending on, or you just have rain and sun in Vancouver.
Yes. We have a little bit of snow sometimes.
Yeah, but seasonally, it changes what grows at what time of year. So that's why it is important to eat seasonally as well as locally. And the other thing that I want to bring up about deuterium, and I think, it's important to reemphasize as many times as possible that eating whole foods is really how we supply ourselves with the right nutritional content. But, our modern world is full of processed foods, and people once in a while, I hear all the time, everything in moderation. I don't agree with that wholeheartedly, but lots of people who eat processed foods. Just to give an idea behind the deuterium content. So at the equator, the seawater is about 155 parts per million of deuterium. A high deuterium content in something for us in the body would be 160 or 165. That would be considered a high deuterium content. Processed foods, including processed vegetable oils, are in the order of between 200 and 300 parts per million of deuterium. So that's one of the things that is not really talked about when it comes to the harms of processed foods. We know processed food isn't real food. It's not nutrient dense, if anything. It's not something that our cells are going to use to incorporate, or, to run properly, incorporate into the cellular matrix. But
excellent. And another plug from this side too. Check out your local farmers and see if you can get a CSA box, community shared agriculture. A, it's going to support your local economy. B, you're going to get the freshest, most bioavailable food you can possibly get, whether it's just vegetables or from farmers who produce animals and meat products. It's the best. And it's probably, if you're going to get a quality food from a store, it's probably going to be about the same price or maybe even a little less. Some people say, oh, I couldn't do that because I can't afford it. You probably can. So that's my little plug for this whole foods conversation as well.
And I would say that you can't afford not to, because it will come and impact you at some point in your life. And so to me, I'd rather pay for nutritious food than later on think about, although I wouldn't do this, think about paying for whatever treatment of
Right.
problems that arise.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about when is a good time to eat. Circadian rhythms we've covered in some of our other episodes, and it always bears repeating, because this is so important, and I'm just learning along as with everyone else listening to you. So maybe refresh us about circadian rhythms and how that impacts how and when we eat.
Right. Okay. So it was fascinating when I started learning about this, because I had absolutely no idea the impact that timing of eating really had. And so circadian rhythms, for those, just to recap, is how our body runs on this 24-hour cycle with the light and darkness. So the light during the day and the darkness at night. And we have all these processes in the body, some which run during the day and some which run during the night. And it's important to get the proper signaling for light and darkness for these functions to occur properly. So the circadian rhythms, when they are mismatched, once again, can cause chaos. They can cause confusion. So the information that's coming in it's not matching. Okay, let me start again. The mismatch occurs when you're getting the wrong signal at the wrong time of day. So with food, normally one's going to understand we eat during the day. We're not going to eat while we're sleeping at night. So all of our gastrointestinal functions are going to be running during the day. So light, as we talked about earlier, is the first signal, the primary signal for your circadian rhythms, to get the right light at sunrise. It tells us to start the day, to get all of the things running during the day, our brain function, our gastrointestinal system, going, our muscular activity, and all of the digestive juices going. So really, at the beginning of the day, we need to eat within 30 to 60 minutes of rising, because food is what's called a secondary Zeitgeber timekeeper. So light is the first one, food is the second one. So it reinforces the circadian rhythm. And I know there's lots of information out there. People talk about, do you eat breakfast? Do you skip breakfast? And I'm going to touch on skipping breakfast in a minute, but a lot of people do it. And it's gone back and forth over, I don't even know how many years. I know that it feels like every few years I heard different information, but I understand now why breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Interesting. And let's put that in the context of intermittent fasting too, because that is huge right now. I don't know if it's going to go away, but it's been around for years, but it's huge. People are doing this and saying, yes, I eat 2 meals a day, so I've skipped breakfast, I save money, blah, blah, blah. So you're saying something very different than that.
And I do intermittent fasting, but I'll explain in a minute why I do it slightly differently. So breakfast is the first meal, and it's the most important meal of the day. Then technically, and again, I can explain this in a little more detail too, we should be having 3 distinct meals, 2 or 3 distinct meals a day, and no snacking. And then we should have, really ideally, about 5 hours from our last bite of food until we go to bed. So 5 hours is a lot for people. I would say at least 3, we're not ever going to be perfect all the time, right? But really more times than not, we should have an empty stomach before going to bed. Otherwise, we talked about it in I believe it was the last episode, how we stretch out the timing of the daytime functions, and then we don't get the repairs and everything that is supposed to take place at night. We don't get the melatonin increasing like we should for the time. We have too much cortisol running around. We're spending energy digesting food, etc. So the timing is actually just as important, if not more important, than what food you take in. And because I have seen with clients literally not changing what they're eating and drinking Diet Coke and all sorts of processed, not non-food, changing the time of their intake of it and being able to lose weight and change symptoms. So the timing is extremely important. So the reason that it's also important not to snack, and I know this is also a big one for people because so many people say, well, I get hypoglycemic. I have to snack every hour or two or something. So our bodies run on two types of fuel. We run on glucose and we also run on ketones. And again, I touched on this, I think, in one of the other episodes. Ketones are the breakdown products of fat. Ketones come around in our body when there's no more sugar to be had as fuel. That only happens when we have extended periods where we're not putting sugar, some type of carbohydrate in our body, which is very rare in our society nowadays. So the other thing is when we eat foods, anything to do with carbohydrates, even proteins are ultimately broken down into and become glucose, as seen by the mitochondria, which I'll explain in a minute. But when we break things down into glucose, sugars and glucose, we then have insulin released, right? Insulin is the hormone that allows sugar to go inside the cell for our cells to take up sugar. There has to be a period of around 4 hours after the insulin release for another hormone called leptin to be released. If we don't give that period of time, then the leptin doesn't get released. And people are going to want to listen to this because leptin is a master circadian hormone, but it is released by fat cells and it goes to the brain and docks in the brain. There's an extra signal at night, but it happens during the day as well, to tell the body how much fuel it has on board. And by fuel, I mean fat. So if that docking does not happen in the brain, then the body assumes, so it's an energy accountant. If it doesn't happen, the body assumes we are lacking in fuel and it will hoard every single piece of food as calorie, as fat on your body that you take in. So that is a big reason how people can put on fat, even though they are eating, good food, or they're dieting, or whatever they're doing, they're exercising. If they have what's called leptin resistance, which shows up about 6 to 7 years before insulin resistance, then that can be a huge problem. And interestingly enough, for us in Canada, it is very difficult to find a place that does any kind of leptin testing. And I don't know any of my colleagues that even have heard of the hormone leptin, at least from me asking around. I know that in Alberta, one of my friends, Justine Stanger, she's incredible, but there is a place in Calgary that you can get your leptin measured. I've not found any place in BC. My family doctor didn't even know what I was talking about when I asked her. So, and not through any fault of her own, but
yeah, so many things are just not taught that we're learning about now.
yes. And so I was going to come back to the intermittent fasting, unless you wanted to ask a question.
No, please, intermittent fasting.
So I used to do intermittent fasting, skipping breakfast, because really it's the easiest thing to do after you've just fasted all night. You get up and you just push your breakfast or lunch or whatever you want to call it, your breaking the fast till 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because you've already been fasting. What most people do then, and what I was doing, was I was then exercising on that, in that fasted state on an empty stomach in the morning. I don't drink coffee, so I didn't drink coffee, but almost everyone I know would have a cup of coffee before they would exercise, and then they're fasting and skipping breakfast. So basically what you're doing is you are escalating your cortisol response by doing that. So when you wake up in the morning with the light signal, your body, your brain and your body is saying, okay, it's daytime. I'm expecting food. That's what's supposed to happen. I need to fuel my body for the day, for my brain to work, for my muscles to work, for everything in my body to work. I need food to make energy. And then there's no food coming in. So then the body says, oh my God, we're kind of in a bit of danger now because there's no food. We're in scarcity mode. Now let's pump out the cortisol, because with the cortisol release comes what's called gluconeogenesis. Glucose is released into the blood so that you have some energy. So you get cortisol, more cortisol being released than should be at that hour of the morning. Now, if you take in coffee, coffee is actually an alkaloid poison. I could do a whole talk on coffee, caffeine. I thought I was good because I didn't drink coffee. And then suddenly I was like, no, actually I eat chocolate, dark chocolate every day. So that's where I actually gave that up for the most part. But caffeine stimulates the fight or flight response. So it stimulates more cortisol release when you have that coffee on an empty stomach in the morning. Then you work out on top of that. You are putting your body under more stress, again, with no food at that time of day. So really you are pummeling your body with cortisol, and cortisol, which is normal and natural and needed. But when it is too much and at the wrong times of day, then that's when it causes problems. And it causes a multi-systemic, like it is multi-system problem. It can affect every single system in the body. So what I have now done is I fast, for example, I'll do 24-hour fasts sometimes every week, sometimes every 2 weeks, but I go breakfast to breakfast. So I eat a good breakfast and then I don't eat until the following breakfast.
And what's a good breakfast? And everybody's going to be different, but from your perspective, what's a good breakfast?
So from this quantum biology lens and looking at our mitochondria and looking at stabilizing blood sugar for the entire day, your breakfast impacts the rest of the day as far as your blood sugar. So really eating protein, high protein and more fat content at breakfast time is what will stabilize your blood sugar for the rest of the day, even if you eat sugary foods the rest of the day. So for example, I eat scrambled eggs, and I cook them in local grass-fed butter. I have sometimes a little piece of salmon, like lox or something, and some macadamia nuts. I was eating a little piece of cheese. I've stopped the cheese because for a different reason, but anyways.
Dairy, let's have a conversation about that another time too.
Yes.
Carry on.
Yes. So you really want to limit the carbohydrates at breakfast. Sometimes I'll make myself, for example, like a frittata, which has some ground beef, and I'll put in stuff like sweet potato and onions, mushrooms, just to kind of fill it up also a little bit. And then there's the scrambled eggs on top, and it's seasoned with spices, and just so it's a little bit different. But you want protein and fats at breakfast. And what I didn't mention yet, and what I touched on earlier about protein ultimately being seen by the mitochondria as sugar, we have in our mitochondria, where our energy is made, we have what's called the electron transport chain. So the key term there is electron. So food is broken down ultimately into electrons. We don't have like a carbohydrate, protein, and fat chain. Those are broken down further into electrons. And there's two spots where at the beginning where electrons enter either from fat, or one spot is from carbohydrates and proteins. So that's why I say that the mitochondria sees the electrons from carbohydrates and proteins as the same. It enters the same spot in the mitochondria.
And I would like to relate all this back again to light, because we're down the trail and I know it's all related. What would you say to somebody who's a vegan, who is not eating eggs or any animal products whatsoever? What would you recommend for a vegan to start their day with?
That's an interesting question. I actually have not been asked that before. I mean, there are other proteins, right? I would say that if you're vegan, then you're probably best suited living at or in the tropics, for how you would receive the light, because if you're in more northern latitude and you're not eating any meats, then you're going to be mismatched with the information in the food, right? Because that food is probably then grown in a different environment. But yeah, I honestly would have to think about that, because there's things like tofu. I know there's controversy over tofu as well. I'm not a fan of tofu. But
What about higher protein beans
beans,
and maybe nuts,
lentils,
nuts and seeds?
yeah, nuts and seeds,
Okay.
avocados, for breakfast. You do want the higher, yeah, you want the higher fat and protein content at breakfast.
Okay. So then let's kind of summarize. There's one other thing I want to talk about too, the salt. But so light, the food from where we're living, because the messages are then going to be cohesive and coherent within our systems and enable us to digest properly and receive the proper messages. So food as the light nutrient. Let's just wrap that up.
Right. So the food is information and light is buried in food. So the light that is surrounding us should be coherent with the light that our eyes and our skin sees, because that light information is released in our bodies. So we want the light outside to be the same as the light that is inside of us. And light is how we communicate between cells in our body quickly. That is the primary signaling way that our body communicates. The hormones and the neurotransmitters and all the chemicals, those are downstream, sort of after the information has traveled. It's it's a downstream effect. So the timing of this is just as important, as I said earlier, if not more important, the timing of eating. And yeah, it also is important because, and I didn't mention this, and sorry, now I know you're wanting to wrap this up, and I was going to say one more thing, is the food, depending on the environment that the food is grown in, whether there are environmental stressors on the plants, those plants are going to have a certain amount of, say, antioxidants, right? And once again, it should be compatible for what we see in our environment. So if we take in a plant which has a bunch of antioxidants, but we're in an environment that's not stressful, our body is going to get confused. So really, the simplified version is eat seasonally, eat locally, eat during the day, eat breakfast. If you want to fast, start with breakfast and fast at the other times of day, because it also allows you to have a nice empty stomach at dinner if you're doing that fast. So it's, you know, 2 times the benefit. And you don't want to snack.
Okay, and you talked about eating breakfast 30 to 60 minutes after you rise, and whether you're seeing the sunrise or not, the first light that you get, 30 to 60 minutes about that time. And then how much later should you be having your lunch meal or your next meal? And then how much later should you be having dinner?
So it's around that 4-hour period because of the insulin release and then the leptin release.
Okay. And salt, how does that factor into this, if it does?
So salt's an interesting one. Salt, most of the studies, as far as the modern medical system is concerned, on salt have been done on refined salt, meaning just sodium and chloride. So most salt, when we mine it, however we get it, is unrefined. So it's got over 80 minerals along with it. That is not the salt that any of the studies have been done on. So all the problems with, for example, limiting salt with the high blood pressure and kidney problems and all that kind of stuff, that has to do with refined salt and sodium content in processed foods. Right? So once again, we're going back to this processed part of things. So unrefined salt, such as things like Himalayan salt, but you have to make sure that things are unrefined, that they say unrefined. Redmond's real salt, Celtic sea salt. There are lots of other unrefined salts. Those are actually really important for our body. We need all of these minerals. We basically brought the sea inside of us. We evolved from sea animals. And instead of having the salt water around us, we have the salt water within us, within our cells. So we need that salt for, once again, water and hydration to stay in the body. And its hydration is it's key to our health. Our mitochondria make water, and that is about cellular hydration. But in order for the water to stay in our bodies, we need the minerals, the salts, we need the electrolytes, and we need to be able to make water.
Water, light, salt, fat, protein. We need all of these. What would you like to leave people with today, Rachel?
Well, what I would like to say is, you know, we have so many different people sharing so many different types of diets and ways of eating and telling us this is the best. And then you have other people, you know, there's so much controversy, and we have so many diet and nutrition books out there, yet we still haven't found the solution. So really what I would say to simplify everything, what our ancestors did is they ate what they could get around them, which is locally. Again, seasonally, they didn't have the ability to really store food. So they ate what was available in that season. And if you stick to whole foods that are local and seasonal, you can't go too wrong. You'll be a lot better off than trying to follow some dogmatic diet.
Yes, so I love that. Eat locally, eat seasonally, and eat according to the times of day that serve us in terms of light. Wonderful. Rachel, we are so grateful to have you here with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we're doing this because you matter.